You're welcome. You are always welcome. But you said since you're recording it, I can shut down my video and my sound. So you gave me that option. Anyway, my name is Jeff Cook. I am the county extension agent in Taylor and Peach counties. And I am also the area peach agent. So I deal with peach growers across the state. If you, just in case you don't know just a little bit about peaches in Georgia, we are the third largest peach producing state in the country. But most of those peaches are produced in 5 counties directly around me. They're Macon, Crawford, Taylor, Peach, and Monroe. So that's where the majority of the peaches, about 98% of the peaches grown in Georgia, come from those 5 counties. And I'm also the strawberry person. Like Brooklyn said, a lot of the newer agents ask me questions about all sorts of stuff, extension, and that's just because I've been doing this is my 25th year, so I've been around for a little bit. With that, I'll get started, and like I said, I definitely like to take questions during my talks. Keep it kind of informal. So if you have something, shoot it to Brooklyn. If she can't get to it, maybe I'll catch it while I'm presenting. And I am very Zoom illiterate, so hopefully I get this right. And I'm gonna try and change between some screens, so maybe I won't cut off everything and lose everybody. But really, when it comes to fruit, the things I talk to people about when they're talking about wanting to plant fruit and things that you need to consider, first and foremost, is variety. Depending on where you are in the state, that's gonna play a big role in what varieties of different fruit you can grow. And what types of fruit you can grow. With varieties, you've got to look at things like the weather, your climate, and dormancy. And we'll talk about that as we get into some fruit more specifically. And then for varieties, you also got to think about pollination. Some things you can have one tree of, some things you have to have multiple trees of if you want to ever have a fruit. If you just want pretty flowers, you can put one tree out there. But if you want fruit, sometimes you have to have multiple varieties just to help with pollination. We do live in the Southeast where it is hot, humid, and wet. We get a lot of rain, so we can grow any fruit just about that you can grow in the country in Georgia. We also can grow every disease and every insect known to man in this part of the world. So, looking at trees, fruit trees with regards to resistance, if there's any kind of disease resistance, that's a good thing to look at if you can find trees that have resistance to the diseases or insects that we have in this region. And then other things to consider are maintenance. A lot of people plant muscadines, and I'm not talking about muscadines today, but a lot of people plant muscadines and don't realize that you have to prune them hard every year. Same goes for peaches. Same goes for apples. If you do not maintain the trees through pruning, trellising, thinning, then you end up with an overgrown mess that you can't reach the fruit if you do actually produce some. And lastly is site selection. If you have small acreage, if you have a small property, there's not a lot of places you can really choose. But if you do have a little bit more room to move around and pick and choose, we'll talk about site selection where, some places where you should and where you maybe should not put fruit trees. I like to put this one in here, and it's got all fruit in it because I do a lot of all fruit talks, but this is my homeowner classification. This is with regards to maintenance and how hard it is to grow. So, low maintenance, anybody can do it. I can do it. Muscadines, figs, persimmons, and strawberries, they're fairly easy to grow. A few diseases, but not really many. Don't require a lot of care other than maybe pruning. The medium difficulty is, your pears, blueberries, blackberries, grapes, and pomegranates. We can grow them fairly easily, still require a little bit more work. And then the high, that's my classification of, not many people should try it. They're very difficult to grow. Peaches and plums definitely are and nectarines are up on top of that list. Some apple varieties do well in Georgia, so that's kind of it's a low high fruit tree. And then raspberries, which we won't talk about. Definitely with regards to any of the fruit trees you buy, make sure you get them from a reputable source. And we'll talk about it a little bit more. But when I say reputable source, a nursery that can tell you exactly what variety it is. And because most of our fruit are grown on a different rootstock, which I'll talk about, if they can tell you what rootstock it's on, you definitely know they definitely should know what it is, and it should be a quality tree, something that's going to work in our area. So site requirements for all fruit trees, you want full sun if you can get it. Full sun helps with photosynthesis to help with producing, a greater number of fruit. The more sun you have, the more fruit a tree can carry. It also helps, especially in the Southeast, helps the trees dry out quicker. If you got full sun, with dew, rain, helps the leaves, help the fruit dry out quicker, so you get less disease. For your soil, we can't choose our soil on our spots, but try a well-drained soil that has most of the time we have got to adjust our pH to get it to 6 to 6.5 for most of our fruit trees to do well. Some exceptions would be like a persimmon, which can handle, it does well, does okay at 5.5, and even a fig will do okay at a little lower pH. And then if you got the option, good air drainage or good air movement. A lot of people don't pay attention to this, but on a cold morning, cold air is going to drain to the bottom of the hill. I get this from a lot of people, and I'll talk about it a couple of times probably. A lot of folks that have a little bit of property might have a low spot on their land, and a low spot has really dark dirt at the bottom, and they say that's the richest dirt on their place. Well, a lot of times the darkest dirt on your place is really not the richest. It's just the most waterlogged. So it stays waterlogged and somewhat anaerobic. For one, that's not a great place to plant fruit trees because it is waterlogged. It's not well drained. The other reason is because whenever it gets cold, that cold air is going to settle down to that bottom, and that's where you're going to get frost damage. You're going to get cold damage. Things like you'll lose crops due to frost, and you can also lose trees and things due to just the air getting cold down there and actually injuring the bark and the trunks and scaffold limbs of the trees. That's just what I said right there. I mean, now that we talked about it a little bit, if you go out this winter sometime on a cold morning, even if the wind's not blowing, if you stand at the top of a hill, you usually can feel a slight breeze of cold air blowing down the hill. And that's just that cold air settling to the bottom of the hill. I say, so on our publications, the UJ Home Garden public, fruit and vegetable site, or the Home Garden series site, in our books, most of our publications, it breaks down the tree fruit zones, as 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So you can choose what zone you're at, and pick varieties that are suitable to those zones. And some of our publications will tell you that there are certain tree fruit that are not really suitable to us. Zone 5, we really don't have a lot of apple trees that are really well suited to zone 5. But there are a few you can try, and if you're down in South Georgia or farther south in another state. With regards to variety, with fruit, you also have to take into consideration if a fruit is if a tree is self-fruitful, or if it is not. If it needs cross-pollination, you need 2 varieties. And if it's self-pollinated, you can get by with just 1 tree. So all peaches are self-pollinating. So you only have to have 1 tree to produce fruit. Plums, which are very, very similar to peaches, most of them are actually self-unfruitful. They require a pollinator. There's a couple that can pollinate. Apples and pears are other ones that will require cross-pollination. And we'll talk about that as we move into the specific fruit trees. But this just gives you the breakdown. Peaches and nectarines, figs, and then your blackberries and things are self-fruitful. And then your self-unfruitful will be apples, pears, persimmons, blueberries, and plums. The nice things about apples and pears is there's enough pome fruit natives out there that a lot of times you get pollination with just having 1, because you got wild species out there in the woods, crab apples and things like that. Crab apples are really good pollinators for your apple varieties. So let's start with site prep, because this is probably the #1 thing that people do wrong. It's the #1 thing I see people do wrong. And I will say this, I even see commercial peach growers that plant trees wrong all the time. They won't admit it, but they do. So dig your hole. I would say this too, and I don't have this anywhere other in the talk, but I really like to, rather than get a potted tree of any sort, I'd rather get a bare root tree if I'm gonna plant. A lot of times they're smaller, which is nicer because you can start with a better tree. You can actually shape it as you want. But they also just don't have a big root ball that it tends to, I think, get in the way of planting. But either way, start with a spot that's, well, pardon me, let me go back. Take a soil sample first. Take a soil sample first and see what your pH is. See if you need to adjust the pH. If you need to adjust the pH, then I would recommend doing it at least in a 10-foot diameter circle around where your fruit tree is going to be planted. Larger would be better, but at least 10 feet, because in year 3 or 4, those roots should be exploring 10 feet out from the trunk if everything's going well. But definitely when you're digging your hole to plant the tree in, you want something about 2 times as wide as the root ball or 2 times as wide as the roots. If it's bare root, it can be definitely a smaller hole. And you want to dig it as deep as the roots or the root ball are, either came from the nursery or out of the pot. Once you've done that, this doesn't say it, but once you've done that, what I would do is, once you've got your hole, it says place the tree at the same depth it was in the nursery, or place it the same depth it was in the pot. But I would tell you to plant that tree with a little bit of the first roots that you can see just a little bit above the ground. That tree, no matter what you do, that tree, the root ball, the bare root is gonna settle. And you're not gonna hurt the tree's not gonna be hurt if a few roots are out of the ground and dry out a little bit, and it's gonna grow off a lot quicker. The other thing with anything you plant to consider when you dig your hole is you should not dig it with the edges, the sides of it going straight up and down. You should dig it where they're angled from there. It's wider at the top and narrow at the bottom, and that forces the roots, as they reach that wall of where you dug your hole, that forces the roots to want to go more up than down. They do better off when they're up in shallower dirt than if they go down. A lot of times, if they go down in the hole you've dug, they'll do like they would in a pot, and they will just become root bound, come back around each other, and can girdle themselves. They put this in here because this used to be the old recommendation. The old recommendation used to be I think you can see, let me see if I can do this. Hang on. Laser pointer. Okay. So you can see right here, this is the bud union. So above is where the scion or the variety you bought is. Below is the rootstock. So we usually have rootstocks that have some sort of resistance to disease, or maybe nematodes, or they grow slower or faster. The old recommendation was to plant 2 inches below the roots, the bud union right here. But you see what happens if you were to plant, 2 inches below your plant right around here, and you've got this much before you get to root. And what'll happen is 2-3 years down the road, you end up with a tree that's just not growing. It's not happy. It's because these roots down here are too deep in the ground. They're staying too waterlogged. They're not getting the oxygen they need, and you end up with disease that just affects the roots, and eventually that tree's going to die. So I would say when you plant this tree, hopefully y'all can see this pointer. If you can, maybe smile or raise your hand. But you would want to plant this tree about right there with the soil line about right there, because it's going to settle some, and a little bit of settling is fine. When I go out on a fruit tree or any tree call, and the tree's looking rough, the first thing I do is dig around the trunk. And if I can't find tree roots within the top inch, I know that's probably one of the things that's causing that problem, causing that tree to have trouble or struggle. What'd I do? Okay, there we go. All right, so once you got it in the ground, water it thoroughly. Soak that ground really, really well, especially if you bought a potted tree. A lot of times those root balls can dry out, pretty easily, and they're hard to get wet again because the planting material in the pots. Water it thoroughly, and early on, if it does settle, you can always come back and pull it up out of the ground a little bit before it starts putting new roots on. You can easily pull it up, let that dirt settle, and make sure that your roots are up there where you can just about see them. And then mulching early on, in a homeowner situation, mulching can help, especially if you don't have irrigation. If you have irrigation, there's really not a need to mulch it. And if you get a tree at the right size, you should not need to do much staking. You should be able to just plant it, let the dirt settle, and that should hold it up. If you do happen to get a larger tree, you can definitely stake it if you need to, put a bamboo stake on it, or tie it off. But I was telling somebody the other day, after first year, you should be able to take those stakes out, be able to take that strap off. If you can't, because if it hasn't rooted well, then something else is going wrong. So you need to figure out what's going wrong. After 1 year, you should have a really good root system that should be able to hold itself up. And then here's another one of the biggest things I see, the biggest issues is, once you get that tree planted, start training it right away. I see a lot of trees. I do a master gardener class with fruit, and I go buy trees from local nurseries. And we'll talk about more about the trees I buy at local nursery, local areas. But a lot of times those trees are already 4, 5, 6 feet tall. They've already got branches on them. Some of them are flowering in the store. It is really hard when you're starting off with a 6-foot fruit tree. It's really hard to prune it back and get good buds that you can actually get scaffold limbs growing. But it's also hard. It's just hard to get that tree. If you don't cut it right away, it's hard to get it back into shape and get it to where you can actually manage it. And we'll talk about it some more. And if y'all have questions about it, we can go. But most fruit trees, if you can get a good, 3-foot tall tree, I would say cut them off. Most of them, you want to cut them off at about 18 to 24 inches off the ground, and then let for the first year's growth, you start training that. As your scaffold limbs and as your central leader.
Jeff, we had a question come in about planting,
Yeah.
that I thought would be really good to address. You talked about adjusting the pH if needed, but do you recommend any soil amendments at time of planting?
I mean, you can definitely add soil amendments to the native soil. I would not go with straight compost or straight, potting mixes or anything like that. I'd make it be a mixture, maybe 50-50 at most. So like the Soil 3, that Soil Cube from Superside, I would mix it in a ratio of like 1 to 1. And the main, I joke around, I jokingly say, why put something really, really good in that planting hole when those roots are going to get out of that planting hole and be shocked. But yeah, so I mean, if you wanted to amend the whole area, yeah, you could do it. But I probably would still say keep it at about 50-50. Don't overdo it, because if you get too much compost or too much material that has really good water holding capacity, you've got that it's surrounded by clay or something. So you've got a large pot with something that's going to hold water. So even if you've got decently well-drained soil, you might just be creating a waterlogged environment right there around the roots. So in year 1, I put non-bearing tree fertilization. So year 1 to 3, and nobody likes to hear this. In year 1 to 3, we don't want to produce any fruit on our trees. So when you buy a tree and you're like, I'm buying one that's already got 3 flowers on it, so I'm gonna have 3 apples. Yes, it'll have 3 apples and it'll try and produce it, but it's going to bend over to the ground, and then you have a really poorly shaped tree. So year 1 to 3, and if you do 1 to 2, I'll be happy. But year 1 to 3, 1 cup of triple 10, late winter, early spring, and then 1 cup later in the summer. And then remove the fruit, remove the flowers for the first 2 to 3 years. Focus on the tree structure. We'll talk about it when we talk about fruit trees and when I get into the specifics, but focus on the tree architecture. And if you can do that, then year 4, 5, 6, 7, 15, you'll have a lot more fruit. You'll be able to pick it. You won't have to get on a step ladder. You'll have a lot less disease and a lot less problems. And then as you move into bearing tree fertilization, you just up it, 2 to 5 cups of triple 10 in 2 applications a year. Some things to consider, if you have a really big crop load, if you have a big, if you have a bunch of peaches, you may need to put a little bit more out there to keep that tree happy. If you're sandier versus if you're clay, you may need to put a little bit more out and maybe spread it out into 3 applications. If you start noticing that you're not, I'll say this, fruit is hard to grow in Georgia on a tree. fruit trees are not hard to grow in Georgia. Fruit trees in Georgia grow like weeds, really. They actually grow too much most of the time. We have a lot of pruning we have to do. But if you're not getting good shoot growth, if you're not getting 6 to 8 inches of shoot growth every year, then you may want to put a little bit more. If you're getting excessive shoot growth, you may want to back off what you're putting. We're really, when we're growing fruit trees, we're really trying to grow the fruit, not the trees. So we don't really need to over fertilize. If you over fertilize, if that tree is excessively vigorous, it will actually reduce the amount of fruit it puts on. Year like last year, if you had peach trees in your yard and you lost everything like we did down here, don't fertilize. Not only just because you're saving money, but because a lot of times that tree can use what was put out in the previous year. And if there's not a crop load on it, you can probably cut back on what you need to put out. And then if you have an existing fruit tree and you need to cut it back, to get it more manageable, if you have to cut off more than, say 40%, then the following year, I would just not recommend to fertilize the following year. There'll be a lot of stored energy in that tree, and you will get a lot of growth on a fruit tree following a year of heavy pruning. Next on when you're some considerations is thinning, and we'll talk about this. We can talk about it later too. This is one thing that people have trouble doing. They have trouble, once you make a crop, once you see that all those flowers actually turned into a fruit, people have trouble actually, pulling fruit off. But if you were to go to a commercial peach orchard and see, these trees will put 1,000 fruit on. If we let all 1,000, continue to grow, then we would have golf ball size peaches at the end of the year. So there's a few reasons we thin to reduce the crop load. It increases fruit size, it increases the quality, and it also helps with the following year with return bloom. And you got to think about that from a stress point of view. If you have a peach tree that's got 1,000 flowers on it and they all pollinate and make a fruit, that tree is trying to produce 1,000 fruit. So it's putting a lot of energy into all those fruit. So it putting energy into these fruit throughout the summer, and at the same time, it's trying to put flower buds at the end of the shoots for next year's crop. So if it's stressing out trying to fill 1,000 fruit, with make a peach, then it doesn't have enough energy to put towards trying to produce flower buds for the following year. So you'll have a lot of smaller return bloom for the year after a heavy crop if you don't thin some. But the main reason for it is I don't think anybody wants, a golf ball size peach. It's just too much work, because it doesn't matter how big the peach is going to be. The pit's going to be the same size. So you're going to get a full size pit with, just a few little millimeters of flesh around it. Hopefully y'all can see this. But this is just an apple. You can see all the fruit here that are coming off the spur, and these fruit here and these fruit. And then once you've done your thinning, you've taken off almost all the apples. And I know no homeowner is going to do all that, but if you went from 5 to 2, that would be great, and you'd be a lot happier with what you get. And a lot of times, what you see on an apple or pear, you have a king fruit. I think that's what they call it, a king fruit. It's the first flower that forms, and it's usually going to be your biggest one anyway. So a lot of times they leave that central fruit to make the larger. There it is right there. Make your larger apples or pears. Let me go back over here. Same thing on peaches, nectarines. You go from all these fruit here. This is a good year when you actually have, fruit, and then you pulled off a lot. So you got one here, one there. My rule of thumb is to take your hand and do like that. And that's about how close you want them. I spread my fingers as far apart when I show people, so that when they go do it, because they'll be like this. So they're if I can get them to thin it out to the fist size between fruit, I feel like I've done something with them. But definitely thin it out, and it's easiest if you do it, when the blooms are on there, because you can do it with a broom, you can do it with a stick, and you can do it a little more quickly. A little bit more difficult when you're walking through trying to pinch off individual fruit. The nice thing about pinching off individual fruit is you can wait till after you feel like we're safe from any kind of late freeze or frost. And you can look at the ones that seem to be developing the best, because you're always going to have some developmental differences along the stem. So you can pick out the ones that look like they're already, making a decent size fruit. Get over here. Where'd I go? There I am. Okay. All right. I'm going to go on now. Does anybody have any questions about just general fruit before I go into specifics? This is where I'm going to try and do something. Before I get into all the specifics, I'm going to try and do this and see if I can. Can y'all, let me see. Never mind. I'm not even doing that. I'll do it later. All right. So for apples, like I talked about, there are some areas in Georgia where it's just really not a great idea to try and grow apples. South Georgia is really not the best part of the state to try and grow them. But there are apple varieties for the entire state that we can grow. This is just an example right here. I'll mention this a good bit, but at UGA, we have what's called the home garden series. So I tell people a lot of times, if you want a publication, if you want to learn how to grow apples or what varieties work for your area, if you just type in home garden series, or if you type in home garden apple, UGA home garden apples, it will pull up our publication. It's 3 or 4 pages, and it gives you everything from start to finish: planting, maintenance, fertilization, pruning, but it also gives you the varieties. And with the varieties, like we talked about, the number one thing with varieties, make sure that you get a variety that's suitable to your area. You can see on these on the apple varieties, it tells you what zone they're suitable for. So these are actually, Anna and Dorset would actually be things you could grow in South Georgia. And then it gives you a use, whether it's good for just fresh eating, or if it's only good for canning, or if it's only good for, for apple pies. It tells you things like that. And then your pollination code, that's what's really important with apples and pears, because they are self-unfruitful. You want to make sure you have 2 varieties that actually pollinate or actually flower at the same time, so pollination can occur. One thing I did learn from the apple guy up in North Carolina when we had apples here in Taylor County is that crab apples, a white flowering crab apple, is a very good pollinator for apples. We actually had a commercial orchard, and he recommended planting a crab apple every 10 trees. So we had crab apples mixed in with our apple planting. And these are, let me go back real quick. These are some that are more common. Names are more common. You've maybe heard of them. And there's other ones in our book. This is just a subset of the ones that are in our book. But if you want to be organic, you want to not spray anything, ever have to worry about it, some truly disease-free, here's your 5. These are 5 apple varieties. They're not a Honeycrisp. They're not like a cosmic crisp thing, apple, they're not going to be like that at all. But these right here, I can tell you right now, I've got 10 in my yard. I never spray them. All I do is maintain the shape of them. They make apples every year. And the deer love them. The kids love them. I like them, but the deer love them too. But these are, if you want some disease resistance, and I'll go back to disease resistance. The main reason we can't grow apples in Georgia, or we have trouble, is a disease called fire blight. It's a bacterial disease. If you've got Bradford pears in your yard, or if you've seen a Bradford pear ever, you've probably seen fire blight, where the tips of the leaves the tips of the shoots kind of turn blackish, reddish black, curl over. You get a lot of dieback. That's the disease that hits most apple varieties, and that's the biggest I guess limiting factor for apples in our area. But these 5 varieties are good for disease resistance. They're good. They have good resistance to fire blight and a few other diseases. And the only ones, if you're going to try and do anything organic or try and stay pesticide free, you can definitely do it with those. The other consideration, we talked about it in the beginning, talking about rootstocks. It's important to know, because if you get a seedling or the MMs, the M series, these are going to be, a lot of the M's are going to be fairly big trees. They're going to get 18, 20 feet tall and quickly, and they're going to get pretty wide. So, if you plant one on these rootstocks, you're going to need a pretty good bit of space, 20 feet between the trees or 18 feet between the trees. As you get into some of these dwarfing rootstocks like Geneva, M9, you know, 50%, you see 50% of standard, 30 to 40% of standard. All the trees I've ever planted are all on Geneva. The book will tell you that it's not recommended for homeowners, but I just tell homeowners and small orchard is that you just need support. They require support, which can be a trellis, it can be a 8-foot 8-foot T-post. It doesn't have to be anything special. If you have a bad deer problem, it can be a large tomato cage where you're just tying branches to the edge of the tomato cage. I mean, just, you know, not really a tomato cage, but a wire support. But the nice thing about the Geneva is that it is dwarfing the trees. You know, you can keep them at 10 feet tall for the entirety of their life. They don't want to grow. And the lack of vigor in that tree actually helps it produce more fruit, which doesn't make sense to a lot of people, but it actually will, the fruit, I mean, the tree puts more effort into flower buds versus trying to grow. So it's really nice that way, and it's manageable, and you don't have to do much pruning. You know, I don't know how many of y'all have an apple or a pear tree in your yard, but everyone I see anywhere, I don't know how they pick the fruit because they're 30 feet tall, and just, you know, they're basically unruly. With regards to pears, I'm gonna skip real quick. I'll basically here the European ones, the ones that everybody likes that are in the grocery store. Don't try and grow them here. Even, I mean, honestly, in our book, it says Bartlett is not recommended for anywhere in the Southeast. I think it says it in the home garden pear guide. Hybrids between European and Asian are good. You can grow, and then some of the Asian pears. I know this is not the entire list, but this is just some of the ones we can grow. The same thing goes for the pears as it goes for apples. Is you got to have a fire blight resistant variety. And in our book, it does tell you the same thing. It tells you about each variety and what they're good for. If it's good for fresh eating, if it's good for canning, and then definitely your Bartlett, your Bosque, and your Anjou, which are all the ones you see for sale at the store. They will get fire blight. And the interesting thing about these is these are also all the ones you're going to see when you go to buy pear trees at a lot of your box stores. Same thing with the apples. You know, I was at a Tractor Supply this past spring, and they had Honeycrisp apples. And I'm like, man, that'd be great to grow here. You know, we could grow a tree maybe if we keep it alive from fire blight, but it's just not going to be a tree or fruit that's going to be able to produce or live for long in Georgia. So look for fire blight resistance when you're looking at pears and apples, and you can be successful. And this is just a variety, to show you just a little bit of some of the Asian pear varieties. Once again, it'll show you the pollinator code, and it gives you the characteristics of the fruit. With regards to apples, so apples and pears are going to be grown differently than your peaches, plums, nectarines, things. So apples and pears, you're going to try for a central leader. And y'all see this tree, how he started. This guy who looks like it was yesterday. He planted a tree. It's nicely branched down there. But you can see where he made this cut right here. He cut there was 2 central leaders coming off this tree when he bought it. So he had one going here and then this one. He decided that this one was bigger, I guess, probably. And so he made this the central leader. With regards to your trees, when you get them at the store, if you get a well-branched tree that looks like this, you can definitely work with this. And then you've got your scaffold limbs down here. This is going to be where, you know, in 3 years, these are going to be the bigger limbs that are going to support your crop. Hang on a second. My pointer's all over the place. All right, so he cut off the 1 leader. He chose this as his central leader. Go ahead and top it, cut it off right there. If you've ever pruned anything, you know what's going to happen when you top it there. You cut it there, and you're gonna actually have branching from, you know, within the top, the next 6 inches. You're gonna have branching there. An interesting thing with apples that you can do in pears. I know you can do it really well with apples. Pears do it, but they don't do it as well. But since you don't have any branches down here or even here, if you go in there after planting and take a little pocket knife and find the buds on that branch, and if you've got a bud here, if you just make a little bit of a cut in the bark, and peel a little bark away just above that bud. That will stop the flow of oxygen down the branch. And it's almost like you pruned it, but you didn't have to prune it. And what will happen is that bud, the next spring will break, and it'll make you a branch. The branch will, if you cut here, if you put your little cut right there, that branch will shoot out right here. So you'll get some more branching here, because you see what happened. This tree was growing in the nursery, and it's grown, what, 4 feet straight up. I mean, that's not helping you if you want to try and grow fruit. You really need some branches here and maybe branches here that are going to have fruit on them. So with the apple and a pear tree, something I learned was that all the branches are definitely can be temporary. They will replace branches if you have to cut one off. But you want to maintain the lower scaffolds, longer than the upper ones. So your lower limbs are going to be bigger. They're going to be out farther. These are going to be a little shorter. As you start getting too terribly tall up here, you can always come back. You can always come back on this tree. I know it sounds kind of weird, odd, but you could come back on this tree right here, and you could cut it off right here, and maybe even cut 2 of these branches off, and then just start you a new central leader and start new branches here. But in this picture, you can tell where they've actually pinned these branches at a 45 to the trunk. Sometimes you need something to spread it with. If you plant trees on a dwarfing rootstock, and you have to trellis it or tie it down or stake it, like I said, with a T-post, then you can tie these down to either a scaffold, or you can tie them down to a post to hold them at this angle and give them some support. And this is just showing some variations in the central leader, if you can see them. I can't pronounce that word that they use for espalier or something. But this is an apple tree just up on a wall. With the dwarfing rootstocks, you could easily do a trellis like you would do for muscadines, and you can keep those trees really small. But you can see the number of apples on this tree right here. So all these limbs were fairly straight over, straight across probably. Now that they're not supported and they're loaded, they're on the ground. That's why you have to kind of support these dwarf trees. All right, I'm moving on to peaches, the hard one. Even though we're third in the country, they're very, very difficult to grow. If you've ever been around Middle Georgia, or you live in Middle Georgia, you know that they require a good bit of disease and insect control or management. So with peaches, the biggest thing to consider is your chill requirements. So every peach variety requires a certain amount of cold weather during the winter, so that it will break dormancy come the following spring once it warms up. I'll show y'all when we get done with the talk, but depending on where you're in the state, you can go to our weather network and you can pull up the chilling calculator and look at chilling for a station near your area, and look back a few years and get kind of an average of what you normally get. And I normally tell people, if you normally get 850 hours of chill, if that's the average, then you could pick varieties that go from 950 to 750. The reason that's important is if you buy a tree, like I bought a tree this past spring at an Ace Hardware somewhere. I will not name the Ace Hardware, and it was a La Pêche, and I'd never heard of it, so I looked it up, and it was a 400-hour peach. So it required 400 hours of temperatures below 45 during the winter. That kind of peach tree would do well on the coast. It would do well in Florida, but they were selling it in Middle Georgia, northern Middle Georgia. So that tree right there, probably by the end of this month, we'll have 400 hours of chill. So it would have received enough chill hours to break dormancy. So then what would happen, the problem with that is if we got warm in January, if we had a warm 2 weeks in January, it would think that, okay, I received my 400 hours. Now it's time to start flowering. So a 400-hour peach tree, you would have probably be in full bloom. In our area, you'd probably be in full bloom the 1st of February. So what would happen if you're in full bloom the 1st of February, it's going to get cold again and you're going to lose those blooms. So that's why you want to match your chill the chill requirements of the peach to the chill hours that you normally receive in your area. We talked about disease resistance. There's really no disease resistance in any peaches that we grow in Georgia, other than some are more susceptible to bacterial spot, and those would be varieties that have been developed or came out of California programs or other programs that are out west. They don't have the diseases we have, so they don't really test them. They don't really screen cultivars for disease resistance. So that'd be something to consider. They have really good varieties out there, and we grow a bunch of them here. But in a small garden farm situation, I wouldn't recommend it, just because you have to spray a lot with copper to control that bacterial disease. And in years when it's bad, it's really bad. And I mean, even we can't control it when we're spraying. With peaches, definitely rootstock. There are some dwarfing rootstocks now. There's one called MP29, and there's one that should be coming out soon. It's called P22, that are dwarfing rootstocks. So they'll keep the peaches smaller, keep them from growing as much, and keep you from having to prune as much. But if you can't get those, then I would say make sure you find them with Guardian. Guardian's a really good disease resistant variety that is also nematode resistant. It's just a really vigorous rootstock, so those trees are going to grow really rapidly. And then when you're looking at varieties, think about your fruit characteristics. So I don't know if y'all have heard of melting versus non-melting. So a melting peach is that one that when you bite into it ripe, you have to stand over the kitchen sink because it's dribbling down your chin. Non-melting is like eating an apple. It is crispy. I mean, I'm not saying they still taste really good. It tastes like a peach. They just don't feel like a peach. It's hard to tell when they're ripe because they don't get soft. So basically non-melting, they don't get soft. Melting, they get soft. You've got your yellow versus your white flesh, which have a little bit of different characteristics and flavor. And then you have your free or your clingstone. So most everybody I know prefers a free stone peach, because that one is one that you can cut in half. You can twist it. You can pull the pit out. You get every bit of peach that peach made. Clingstone is the one that you get early in the season that you can't get all the peach off of the pit. So you feel like you halfway cheated because you got some fruit left on the pit. But so, I tell everybody, if you are in a situation where you're doing a roadside stand, you definitely want to try and shoot for the freestone peaches, because that's what everybody's really looking for. This is just an example, same thing as with the apples and the pears. These are some that you could produce in Georgia. Obviously, if you're in Pike County and it says Florida King or Gulf Prince, you don't want to grow it. Those are for the coast. Those are low chill, and it'll tell you what the chill requirement is. And also in our guide that we have now, our new one, it tells you when they ripen too, so you can pick a few. If you want to do a few, you can pick a few that ripen at different times. The nice thing about peaches is even though they ripen from May to September, almost all of them bloom about the same time. So that's the nice thing about them. You can, you don't have to have a pollination code with peaches because they're all going to flower about the same time. The problem with that is that they're all going to flower at the same time. So if you have a peach that comes off in September, if you get a fair time, it's called fair time, as in like the fair. If you get that, it comes off in September. So if you flower in March and you come off September, you've got to protect that fruit for a very long time. Whereas if you have one that flowers in March and it comes off in June, you got a lot shorter window that you have to keep insects and disease off that fruit. So that's something to consider too. And for those of y'all that don't know, I mean, we grow about 60 varieties of peaches in Middle Georgia, and that helps spread the harvest out. So we'll pick one variety for about a week, maybe 2 weeks at max. And then as that one's playing out, we've already moved on to a new variety just to extend the season, which our season runs from about the 1st of May to the 1st of August. And let me go back real quick. This is not the complete list. There's a bunch more in there, and there's a bunch of other varieties I would recommend too. I mean, I know in over that way in Pike, you got Bottoms Nursery that does a lot with fruit trees. Then you've also there's some other nurseries that, Brooklyn could tell you about, or I could tell you about up in Tennessee, that will ship peaches to you, bare root peaches. Like I said, but this is a good list here. You can go on a lot of the nursery sites and you can see what they have available too. That is one problem I'm finding out we're running into with South Georgia. I'm getting a lot more requests from South Georgia, people wanting to plant peaches, and it's hard to find a nursery that grows the peaches that are, that are developed for down in South Georgia or North Florida. I even called a Florida nursery and they didn't have any of the low chill peaches. They only had high chill peaches. With plums, hybrid plum varieties are adapted to Georgia. The European and Japanese are not. So those big old juicy ones you get out of the California orchards, they don't really do well in Georgia. But there are a good bit that are suitable for Georgia. This is a small list. There's a few more. There are a few more available. Methley's one that's about the only one we have that's self-fruitful. Anything that has an AU before it was developed at Auburn. So even though it's developed at Auburn, we still grow them over here. And then these are some other ones that are some of these were developed over in Byron at the Tree Nut and Fruit Lab, the USDA lab over there. This gives you your zone where you can grow them. They need cross pollination, so planting 2 different varieties. And then it's also, and it's in our guide, it's also important to know some of these some of these different trees have sterile pollen. So definitely with those, you're going to need 1 or 2, I mean, at least 2, but you may need 3. They have been, and plums honestly have the same issues as peaches, same diseases, same insects. With plums, it's kind of nice because we don't really necessarily want a huge plum. And they do usually get zapped by at least a little bit of cold. So we don't normally have to thin plums. We usually they kind of get thinned out by themselves by the cold. So you don't usually have the problem of thinning and having to worry about return bloom. Let me see where we're going. This is just a real quick list of the rootstock. We talked about the apples. Most pear are going to be on a seedling rootstock. So you cannot get the dwarfing effect in the pears like you can in the apples. And then Lovell and wouldn't plant Nemegard here in Georgia. You only plant that in South Georgia. But Lovell and Halford would be 2 plum rootstocks you could use. And then this is the list of all the peach rootstocks, but I really just try and find something that's on Guardian because that gives you some resistance to diseases and nematodes. With peaches, it's a little bit different. We don't grow them on a central leader. Not saying you couldn't. If you wanted to grow a central leader, you could. But with peaches, we usually grow them on an open center. So if you got a tree like this, it'd be really nice. We don't normally see trees like this, but this is a really good looking tree to plant. And I don't know if you can see these lines in here. There's a line there and a line there. So once you get this thing planted, you cut it here and cut off one of these little scaffold limbs, because really about 4 scaffold limbs is all you want. If you had a tree, just imagine that your tree it looks like this up here. If you cut it right here, then these 4 buds right here would be your new scaffold limbs, and that's what would form the following year. But the next picture shows you what happened what it looks like the next year. So I know it looks pretty sad and pathetic, but if you plant it correctly and you do it and you do this, then you will have a really well-shaped tree after the first year. And this is what the same tree looks like after year 1. You got some really good branching, some good upright growth, and then you come back in and let me go back. So you would come in on this tree right here, and these your scaffold limbs down here, you would probably try and use these. You may want to avoid this one because it looks a little bit weak. And then as you get up, you cut the center out, and as you get up here, you would cut off to have outwardly growing branches. So you're going to grow up and out every year, and then next year you're going to cut here, and it's going to grow out, and that keeps your open center. It allows for airflow in the center of the tree, and it allows for sunlight to penetrate the tree. And that helps with ripening, and also with disease, with drying out, so the diseases are a little bit less. Wait a minute, I lost my pointer again. And that's what I was saying right there. So you want to prune the outward growing shoots right here. So he's cutting this whole thing off right here. Outward growing shoots, keep it growing outward. Away from the center, and then each year you'll get growth in here, and it'll be growing up because once you open up that area to light, you'll have it growing that way. Every winter, you're going to want to come back in there and clean that scaffold up and cut off any of that backward growing or upright growing stuff that's going back into the tree. And that's just a little bit, that's a more mature tree, just showing you how much, we cut off every spring. And honestly, if you look at this picture, most of this up here, I would cut off because you're going to have way too many fruit up there. And with that, I guess I'm done with fruit because I was looking to see what I had next. But I can touch on other fruit if you want me to, on other trees. I didn't have persimmons in here. But persimmons are fairly easy. There's a few of the Japanese persimmon varieties. I don't have the variety list. The biggest thing with persimmons is they say they're so fruitful, but they do a lot better with pollinator. So having multiple Japanese persimmons, I see a lot of issues with Japanese persimmons with people. One thing I see with Japanese persimmons is people overdo it. They over fertilize, they overwater, and they just take too good a care of them. They really like to be neglected kind of. But the other thing I see is like people have one persimmon, it flowers, it has male and female flowers, it flowers and it makes fruit. But about the time the fruit look like they're getting ready to be ready, they start falling off. And that's just because they did not pollinate correctly. So if you have persimmons, you definitely want to have two of the, two to have better pollination. And then they have astringent and non-astringent persimmons, which I have not really found many of the non-astringent or none of the non-astringents that aren't somewhat astringent. And then if any of y'all ever bit into a persimmon when it wasn't right, it'll make you pucker up for an hour or so. And then with figs, figs are another low maintenance one. I didn't put them in here because honestly, as long as you put them in a spot that's well drained and doesn't freeze a lot, late freeze, they're fairly easy to grow. You don't have to thin them, and you can prune them however you really want to. If you want them to grow upward, you can cut to an upward facing bud. If you want them to grow out, you can cut them to an outward facing bud. If you've got a fig that is overgrown, you can cut it off of the ground every 3 years and just start a new tree. Very low maintenance, don't require fertility really, and don't require water much unless it's just really, really dry. The biggest issue with figs, is just cold. Some of them are really susceptible to cold injury, and a lot of people have problems with them just dying off every year. But most figs, are very low maintenance. Do you have to cold protect young fruit trees with wraps, etc.? And it is best to plant now. It is best to plant fruit trees now because you get better root growth. You get a lot of root growth during the winter, and that tree will be better off in the following year. And you don't have to really protect them from cold. The only thing you really want to protect a fruit tree from, they're all really thin barked. So when they're young, they are susceptible. They're more susceptible to sun scald, but that sun scald happens in the wintertime, and it happens when you have really cold nighttime temperatures and the next day is super sunny. And so that south facing bark is in really intense sunlight all day. You'll get sun scald on that side of the tree, and you can actually get splitting. So what we do on commercial peach orchards, we paint the trunks white. But yes, you could get a tree wrap. You could get, the guys up here they use paint, or they also use a little tree wrap that looks nothing but a tall, skinny milk container. So like an orange juice container, cut it down the side, wrap it around the tree, tape it, and leave that on there for 2 years, and then you can take it off. That's the only protection that I do, that I would do on any young peaches or apples, because they are, if you really look at them, they're really thin barked and it can get damaged pretty easy. That'll also keep your husband or your landscaper from weed whacking it. Weed whacker damage is really bad on trees, so if you put a tree wrap, it'll help with that too.